A chat with Pat.
Yes, and it's Thursday, so you know what that means. It means
Here
Joan
comes
Watson.
Joni.
That's right. She is the associate editor of the Integrated Catholic Life. She writes weekly there called Between the Sundays. But we have been doing a series on the book she wrote, Opening the Holy Door, Hope-Filled Scripture Reflections from St. Peter's Basilica. Hi, Joni. How you doing today?
I am fantastic, Pat. Thanks so much. Good to be here.
Well, it's good to hear your voice again. I'm always amazed at the integration of our faith. Everything touches everything, and what we're going through now in our country, especially with these shootings and things like that. I opened the book to see where we were at today, and it is hope in the face of sin, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. Yeah. Tell us about the panel on the Holy Door at St. Peter's that gave you this title for this chapter.
Yeah, so it's the panel depicting Peter in grief, really, after he's denied Christ. So we have the figure of Christ. He's bound. He's obviously on trial. And Peter there has his head in his hands, and there's a little rooster at the top, which shows us when this is happening. So it's Peter, after denying Christ, his reaction to his own sin in denying his best friend. And so I think there's so much to reflect here when we look at hope. How can we have hope in the face of sin, whether that's our own sin, which is plentiful, whether that's right, hope in the face of someone else's sin and the grief and the tragedy that happens in our world, or even with that's in the face of the sin of members of the church and leaders of the church, as Peter himself was. So there's a lot, I think, to unpack, and this is actually one of my favorite chapters.
Yeah, and there's a woman in this panel. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so tucked between Peter and Jesus is this figure of a woman, and we don't know exactly who the artist thought, to depict, whether right, it was the slave, the servant woman who confronts Peter. But I chose to see it as our Blessed Mother, because I think that's key to our hope. That especially when there's sin in the church or sin on behalf of leaders of the church, we can really affect, obviously, our faith in the church itself. Like, why am I even Catholic when leaders are sinners? And I think in times of temptation to leave the church over Peter, over those leaders in the church, we have to remember that woman there in the background. That's what I think is Our Lady, because Our Lady is the perfect image of the church. We tend to think of the Petrine dimension of the church, the magisterium, the leaders, and that's obviously a very important part of the church. We sometimes forget the Marian dimension of the church, that there's this idea that, Mary is the church. Mary's the perfect example of what it means to be a disciple. Mary's the perfect example of what it means to be the bride of Christ, as the mother of Christ. So this idea that we can cling to the fact that Mary is our mother and Mary's our model, and that she really is a sign of what it means to be Christian. So whether that sin in the world, is a reason for us to want to lose our hope, we find our hope in our Blessed Mother.
Yeah, I love that, Joni. And I got to share this paragraph. It's one of my favorites in this chapter that you wrote. Don't you think that's something the gospel writers should have whitewashed? You're talking about Peter denying Christ. It shoots serious holes in your credibility to keep bringing up the fact that your first pope messed up again and again and again. But this is the good news of Jesus Christ, that he gave us a church not made up of sinless people, but made up of sinners, even the Pope, and the church's goal is to make them into saints. I love that chapter, or that paragraph, because I think you're right. I've always said that. How do you know that the Gospels are real? Well, look what they say about the people that are in charge, right? Why wouldn't they just kind of skip over Peter denying Christ? So I love that you keep saying that the hope of sainthood, and Peter never let go of that, and Judas did. So what do you think this panel can teach us about hope?
Yeah, I think it reminds us that there's always a second chance. There's always, and I talk about this later in the book, but, Judas's greatest sin wasn't betraying Christ. Judas's greatest sin was giving up, right? Was thinking that he was not forgivable. And so in this panel, when we look to Peter, we realize we are Peter every single day. We can point to big sins out there, right? Sometimes other people's sins are far more visible than ours. We like to look at other people's sins and the tragedy.
Yep.
But there's sin in my own life, and I have betrayed Christ. But he always welcomes me home. He welcomes all of us home. And that's what we have to pray for. That's where we place our hope, not in my sin, not in who I have chosen to become, but who Christ has made me to be. Christ has made me to be a saint. He's made all of us to be saints. And so that's where, especially in light of this tragedy in our world today, there's temptation to give up. There's temptation to think, how is the world ever going to get better? I can only control what happens in my own life and the choices I make. And so today, in the face of tragedy, I say we choose again for Christ and say, Lord, when I've messed up, forgive me. I want to be close to you. I want to come home to you. And he'll never, ever, ever tire of welcoming all of us back home if we're truly sorry for what we've done. And that's where we place our hope. Nothing that we are or nothing that we've done can give us hope, but that Christ is there with open arms.
And Joni, one of the lines, think again of the sentence on this panel, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. What did you find in that sentence? That's a powerful sentence, and we look past it many times.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite sentences in the scriptures, because I think only Peter can know what he saw in those eyes. And I think that's why Scripture is so rich, and we don't just believe in Scripture. We also look at the interpretation of Scripture and the apostolic tradition. But because that's a loaded sentence, right? Only Peter knows what he saw. And I can only imagine Peter spending the rest of his life preaching this message that in my darkest hour, when I turned my back on my friend, he turned and looked at me, and I saw his love, and I saw his mercy. I can just imagine the homilies of Peter, the rest of Peter's life, being filled with this hope that, you guys, I did it. I betrayed the Lord. And he turned and he looked at me, not with condemnation, but with love and mercy, if I was willing to come home to him, if I was willing to come back. I think Christ would have turned with that same look of love to Judas. I think of him looking at Judas in the garden when Judas kisses him, right? Christ wasn't looking at him as a judge. He was looking at him as a friend and saying, Judas, why are you doing this to me? Right. And he wants to welcome us home. And so I think that's just such a powerful line, because the Lord looks at us as well. And he looks at us with mercy. He looks at us with love, and he wants us to come back to him.
And there had to be great sadness in the Lord's heart too, right? I mean, I think of that so often, especially in times we're dealing with. There is such a sadness with this, but I think you bring to light here, Joni, the idea that we have to look at people who do things to us with love and mercy. Christ continues to be the role model, the example for us. Peter is who we are, and so we keep looking to Christ like he does. Joni, I love this chapter. Any last thoughts on it?
No, the Jubilee is not over. Go get the book and meditate on this great gift of hope.
Oh, yeah. We're not done either. Joni will be back next Thursday to talk about another chapter in this book. Have a good week, Joni. Week ahead, weekend, okay?
Thanks so much.